So thank you very much. And I'm talking about the prehistoric landscape and cursus monument at Drumadoon on the Isle of Arran in Scotland. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors as well, particularly Kenny Brophy and Gavin McGregor, who have been played a major part in this project. So I'm going to be giving you a sort of whistle-stop tour through some of our work that we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years. So as some of you will know, the Arran cursus at Drumadoon was discovered during a Historic Environment Scotland LiDAR survey in 2017. And some initial work was done over the successive years. And then we basically started excavation work and landscape work between 2021 and 2023, and that work continues. And we're just back from a survey of Macri Moor just a couple of days ago. So the Drumadoon cursus can be seen on the middle part of this image, and you can see it highlighted in the red just here. I don't know if you can see my cursus or not. And it's surrounded by a range of other archaeological features, particularly field systems, hut circles, and also cairns. So it's part of a much bigger, broader landscape beyond the cursus itself. And of course, it's also located very close to the Macri Moor ceremonial complex, which you can see in this image over here on the left-hand side. Sort of the yellow dots. Again, I don't know if you can see my cursus or not, so forgive me if you can. We've had a lot of interest in this site, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found. So first of all, it's a massive, spectacular monument. You can just about see it here in the heather, but so that you can see it, there are these sort of tram lines that sort of identify its location. It's over 1 kilometre long. It has a southern terminus, and the northern terminus is not yet fully defined, although I think we can see it in the LiDAR data. The banks are about 30 to 40 metres apart, and it was constructed on a topographic high within an area of extensive peatland. And basically, the reason this site survives is because of the peat cutting. Peat essentially preserved the whole landscape, and as peat cutting occurred, it then was revealed probably in the last perhaps century or so. And that's one of the reasons why this monument is so well preserved. And it's probably one of the best examples of cursus monuments with upstanding banks. Now, to sort of focus a little bit more on this particular landscape, as I've said, the cursus monument is just part of a much broader picture of Bronze Age fields and settlements, which are shown on this image. These are all being picked up from the LiDAR imagery, and we're sort of ground truthing a lot of that as we progress. Drumadoon is located on essentially a headland above the Blackwater Valley, or the Shiskin Valley, which has got the Blackwater river going through it. And just to the north of that is the complex of Macri Moor. So the area we've been focusing on is shown in this box here. And then here's just an image of Macri Moor, which is a site I imagine many of you are already familiar with, a hugely important ceremonial site. So just to say a few words about the excavations. So this is an image from a couple of years ago, from August 2022, and it was pretty clear fairly early on that the excavation was yielding material of the right sort of age. So we've got lithic materials. This is Arran pitchstone, which is coming up, as well as other material. And that provided a confirmation that this was likely to be prehistoric as opposed to medieval, for example. The amount of lithic material also suggests that there are also Mesolithic material alongside Neolithic diagnostic flint material and pitchstone material. But not a huge amount beyond that in terms of artifacts. In 2023, we went back and opened further trenches, and you can see the location of the trenches on this particular image on the left-hand side. So we're working on a main trench, which is going through the cursus monument itself, and then a couple of other trenches, which have been looking at the monument further along from where we're located. So we're located close to one of the terminus ends. It's probably worth mentioning that the LiDAR data suggests that there is a break in the cursus monument, and potentially it might have had two different segments associated with that. This is what the section through the cursus bank looks like. So talking through the stratigraphy from the base, we've got natural subsoil, which is essentially a glacial sand that was deposited at the end of the last ice age. And then above that, we have a basal stone layer, which is probably deposited, and you can just see it located here. And then the majority of the cursus monument itself consists of turf and topsoil material, which has been added on to create a bank. And then above that, there is a rhyolite capping. Above that, we also have the peat itself, which is very thin in this area. It's probably no more than about 10 centimetres in extent. And there are also a series of potential walls associated with the sides of the cursus monument, one of which is quite a substantial wall, which looked like a sort of collapsed slump wall. It had large, fairly massive stones, and then potentially an earlier wall as well associated with the construction of the monument. In addition to the actual excavations and the structure of the monument, we've also taken extensive samples for environmental analysis, particularly pollen, sedimentary DNA, soil micromorphology, and also for analytical purposes of the chemistry of the soils, for example. The other site that we also looked at, I think that was labelled Trench 3, also shows the rhyolite capping just being excavated just here. So it's quite extensive and quite distinctive in nature. But the rest of the stratigraphy is quite similar to what you see on the rest of the site. We've done some initial resistivity work, and this has been led by Darko Marjovic at the University of Reading. And these are some of the features that Darko was uncovering. And it's clear that there are potentially other possible structures, either immediately outside of the cursus or potentially within the terminus bank. And they have not yet been looked at in any detail, but most likely may require further excavation. Darko has received funding from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to return back this summer to continue a full survey of the whole cursus monument and locate its northern end as well in August. So there'll be further work carried out subsequently. The other features I'd like to focus on are really the wider landscape, which is the element that I've been really leading on. So we've been starting to investigate the wider peatland landscape and trying to understand the relationship between the cursus monument and some of the field boundary walls. So the area we've been focusing on is over here, where you've got these clearance cairns, and FB1, which is a field boundary. And in 2022, we opened a trench over that, just to draw your attention to a number of other field boundaries that you can see just coming off the LiDAR on the right-hand side there. So the Auger survey, we started in summer 2022-23, and we'll be continuing this summer. So primarily the focus here was to establish the wider elements of the landscape and understand the relationship between the cursus monument and the peatland landscape. What we found, perhaps predictably, was that the peats are extremely thin in this area. It's been extensively cut over, in many places probably no more than 20 centimetres of peat. But to our surprise, we found underneath the peats extensive prehistoric soils. Initially, we found about 20 centimetres of these soils, but as I'll show in a minute, the following year we found much deeper soils, which are very extensive. Now, it's worth commenting that other soils were found beneath peats by John Barber and colleagues at a site near Tor Moor, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, together with aardmarks. And these all predate some of the hut circles, so they assign them to a late Neolithic date. So these were found less than a kilometre away, and it's pretty clear that what we got here are the same soils that we believe as those that were found at Tor Moor. This is just so that you can get a sense of the work that we were doing. This was being done with students out in the field. And as you can see, the depth of the peats is not particularly substantial. And we've just been augering the landscape every 10, 20 meters, sort of in a way of looking at the sort of in a keyhole surgery way to establish what the landscape looks like underneath the peats. So we excavated the field boundary at the same time as the main trench was being excavated. And we found very few artifacts actually in terms of allowing us to date this material, apart from a potentially Bronze Age thumbnail scraper. But we did discover these soils underneath the field boundary walls, and these have been extensively sampled. So these are some of the results associated with those that sampling, and these include, you can just about see these are sort of relatively homogeneous soils, and then there is a very distinct sort of horizon here, a compacted horizon, and underneath this are the buried soils. There's evidence of compaction, so maybe before the field wall was constructed, compaction activities were happening, such as perhaps things like grazing animals. And we've also got fragments of charcoal, which might indicate sort of soil enrichment through the addition of material, or maybe it's just becoming incorporated within the matrix. We've also done some initial work of looking at phytolith remains associated with this landscape. As some of you probably know, phytoliths are not a particularly common proxy to look at in the British Isles, because typically we have plant tobacco remains recovered. And one of the challenges is that there's no British reference collection, which Emma is working on. This diagram is associated with the field boundary wall, and you can see the distribution of sedges and monocots. So the sedges are in green and they're indicative of wet conditions, whereas the monocots are grasses and grass-like flowering plants. So they could be standard grasses, but they could also potentially be cultivars. And more work will be needed to try to differentiate those. What we do know, of course, is that the house deposits at Tor Moor, which I've mentioned, do indicate quite a number of cultivars were being cultivated in this landscape. So particularly barley was a major crop, but including naked 6-row barley, but also emmer wheat and bread wheat. So, but we don't know what is being cultivated on this particular location. We also did some soil micromorphology of the main trench, the cursus trench, and perhaps the thing to note here is that there's no distinct boundary between the upper and middle deposits, so it's quite mixed compared to field boundary 1. But perhaps of note is that there are many similarities stratigraphically between what we're seeing in the field boundary and what we're seeing in the cursus monument. And one of the things we want to look at last field season was to start to understand that better. So these are some of the trenches that we opened up in August, which were a continuation of that trench. And we were essentially originally attempting to follow the line of these prehistoric soils, buried soils. And this is one of the sondages that we went through the peat and below to recover samples from. And then, much to our surprise, we found much deeper deposits underneath one of the clearance cairns. So this is about 1.5 meters in depth. The soils are quite extensive, and we were quite surprised to find not one soil, but actually several different soils. So the stratigraphic base here are late glacial sands, probably belonging to the Younger Dryas. Then we've got deposits that are probably early Holocene, and they represent the brown forest soils, we think. Above that, we've got colluvium with aeolian material. There's a lot of windblown sand material. And then above that, again, we've got another soil horizon, which we think are probably improved soils from the Neolithic or Bronze Age. So they've been, the soils have been stabilized and potentially added to. And then above that, we've got silty peat. So the peat probably formed as a consequence of increasing waterlogging and waterlogging and lack of soil, lack of lack of water being able to go through the soil horizon. We do also have an iron pan here, which is probably one of the reasons why peats then form subsequently. And then the peats are above that. And we don't have a date yet on the peats, but we think they're probably late Bronze Age or Iron Age in date. We're waiting back on radiocarbon dates and also OSL dates on these sequences. So a lot of this is inferred, but perhaps of greater importance is that the stratigraphic sequence that we've got here is very similar to what we've got in the Cursus monument, where it's more compressed, but it does suggest that it's at least partially contemporary, if not wholly. These have all been sampled for radiocarbon dates, including a new approach known as ramped oxidation, and we've got money for 30 radiocarbon dates through NEAF and NERC. They've been sampled for sedimentary DNA, pollen, phytoliths, leaf waxes, and also soil biomarkers, which will tell us about whether the soils have had additions of things like seaweed or manure and so on. This is a new technique which is being developed by a colleague in Switzerland. We've also done a lot of multi-elemental analysis, and I'll show you a couple of results from that in a minute. We've got some results on the sedimentary DNA. In fact, much of the sequence associated with the cursus is quite disturbed, and they were not able to get a huge amount out of that. But this sequence from the field boundary 1 is dominated by what I would call a heath vegetation of things like purple moorgrass, heather, erica, and gorse, very similar to the landscape today, in fact. I haven't been sent yet the exact location of where these come from, but I suspect from knowledge of how the sedimentary DNA gets preserved, it's probably from the upper layers, which would suggest that you've got a clear landscape and perhaps it's associated with a heathy vegetation just before peat inception. These soils are actually quite disturbed from the chemostratigraphy work that's been done by Ben Pears and Tony Brown. And this shows that you've got redeposition of older sediments and colluviation around the features. But we've also been able to look at other parts of the sequence, and this is just one example of some of the elemental maps. The thing perhaps to notice is the fact that we've in fact got 3 different soil horizons, and you can see this in the silica reconstruction, which is just in the middle here. So we've got these ancient forest soils, we've got the colluvium, and then we've got another set of soils. They're very sort of almost deliberate nature, Tony has suggested, might be indicative of cultivating soils which have been dug out and stabilized. So we're still analysing these, but they're really interesting. It's quite clear that what we've got here is very similar to what Barbara et al. Found at Torai Moor. And they found these soils also together with aardmarks, and they were associated with some of these late Neolithic structures. And I think it's pretty clear that what we've got at Drumadoon is essentially a continuation of that. We also have a lot of hut structures across Drumadoon, and it's worth highlighting that the organic materials that were recovered as part of Barbara et al.'s excavations really suggest that we're likely to find the same kind of things. And this is just an image to show you some of the material that was preserved at Torai Moor, including wattle, for example, which has preserved a huge amount of plant macro remains materials. The last item I want to just briefly mention, because we've just come back from the field, is that we've been looking also at the wider landscape and trying to work out how these features all relate. So we've been back onto Macquarie Moor itself and to recore the site. This was originally analysed by Robinson in the 1980s. Robinson took a core in the middle here and recovered about 4.5 meters of deposit. You can see from the LiDAR imagery there is extensive peat cuttings. These are all in these areas here. It's really quite a treacherous landscape to work in, but we were really lucky to be able to recover about 5 meters of material. So much of the peat is dominated by carex and phragmites, and it sits on sand deposits, which probably date to the end of the last ice age. But then we were able to go even further, deeper than that, down to 5 meters. And to our surprise, we found thick lake deposits, which go down about 50 centimeters or more, suggesting that the whole of that landscape was essentially started as a big lake wetland system that then eventually became a peat bog. And you can see this material here, it's very thick grey clays. That is actually quite interesting because it does rather suggest that the Macquarie Moor's archaeological material, particularly the stone circles, so you can see one of them here, Moss Farm, a set of other ones are in this area, but there's also extensive hut circles all the way into these areas. These are higher elevation areas, and it's quite clear that these locations were used within an extensive wetland landscape, which had probably initially some kind of lake system and then peat bog systems. And they're all in different basins, so they probably started at slightly different times. So it's quite an interesting landscape to start to unravel. And we've also been doing some work in the Shiskin Valley, and there we found very extensive deposits, paleochannel deposits, which alternate between freshwater and open and terrestrial environments. So they're kind of clays, open water habitats, then peatland habitats, and they're probably all being controlled by tidal and marine conditions, likely caused by rapid sea level changes. We haven't really done huge amounts of work in there yet, but of course, this what's happening in the floodplain is going to be quite important for understanding how Macquarie Moor develops as a system and what that implies about the landscape, the wider landscape within which all this archaeology is located. And we're making quite a lot of progress in trying to unravel all those different elements.
2 minutes.
Eventually, what we hope to be able to do is to construct something like this, which is a large landscape model of a peatland landscape, which will allow us to date the different layers, work out the association between the landscape and the archaeology and the wetland deposits, and understand the whole evolution of this landscape. So sort of to conclude, I think what we have here at Drumadoon is an amazing landscape. We've got a contemporary or near contemporary farming and settlement landscape alongside the Cursus monument. And clearly some elements we think either relate very closely or are contemporary based on stratigraphic similarities. And that really has opened up a fantastic opportunity to understand the various components of this landscape alongside the farming elements. And the recovery of the soils in particular has been quite unusual and unexpected, but also they offer us great potential for understanding ancient farming practices and soils, and allow us to link the work with the work that was done by Barbara in the 1970s. And so I think what's really clear here is that we've got an incredibly important landscape beyond the cursus itself and the stones. And we're really keen to try and understand the evolution of this wider landscape and how the archaeology at Drumadoon really fits within that and within Macquarie Moor, because they clearly are part of the same continuum. Thank you very much.